The mastermind behind the murder of Swedish bride, Anni Dewani, has been granted parole. Zola Tongo served 12 of his 18-year sentence. In other parole news, convicted murderer Oscar Pistorius is now also eligible. And just recently this week, Morne Haramse, better known as the samurai sword killer, was also released on parole. Well, let's unpack the issue of parole in some of these cases. I'm joined now by attorney Clifford Gordon to help us make sense of it all. Before we get to the confusion and the outrage that parole decisions invariably tend to trigger, Clifford, let's start with what the considerations are. We're dealing here, of course, with people who were not lifers, in that they were not serving life terms. So for that category of offender or prisoner, what are the main considerations in deciding on parole?
Well, main considerations are the length of the sentence, the nature of the offence, and also, as you said, whether the person has been given life in prison or whether it was just a fixed term sentence. Also, whether the prisoner has shown rehabilitation and whether he has shown some kind of remorse at what they've done, and as well as psychological reports and social worker reports that are considered as well.
I see the word rehabilitation emphasized over and over again in the literature around this issue of parole. In the context of someone who is, convicted for murder, such as Zola Tongo, such as the samurai sword killer, such as Oscar Pistorius, do you have an understanding of what rehabilitation would entail? How do we measure that this person, in the time that they've been in prison, they've been rehabilitated?
Well, there are many courses offered by Correctional Services and the social works services within Correctional Services. For example, anger management, and some religious orientated courses. Those are basically as well. There are also some vocational courses, for example, electronics and that type of thing, and they can see how well a offender does in that environment. And they can see also whether the person has shown genuine remorse or whether they are trying to fake remorse just to get out.
Sure. And how much does the voice of the victim's family, how much weight does it carry in this conversation? As we are reporting in the case of Anni Dewani, the family were opposed to this decision. One imagines then that the other factors outweighed their voice. Does it work that way? Is there interaction, for instance, between the offender and the family ahead of time, and with what end in mind, if there is that interaction?
There's often interaction between the family of the person who was killed or harmed in the crime, and the weight, it does carry a degree of weight. I mean, if you look at, for example, the case of the late Clive W. Lewis and Janus Valus, the victim, the family of Chris Hani there. Their opinion carried a lot of weight, but I think also because of the political nature of that particular offence, it did carry a lot more weight. Also here, I think the possible rehabilitation of the offender would have also carried quite a bit of weight, and that would have outweighed any objections that the family might have had. Also, I think it would also depend on exactly what the objections were. And unfortunately, I didn't hear the clip, so I wasn't able to hear what they said. But If it was just, well, he should rot in jail, it has to be more than that.
Yeah.
To have him not released if he has some kind of remorse and rehabilitation. If you also, for example, with Oscar's matter, Oscar has had extensive dialogue with Reeva Steenkamp's family, and the restorative justice aspect as well is also taken into account in the granting of parole.
So that's the law as it stands in as far as the books are concerned and how it's practiced in the courts. But please, for a moment, just locate it for us then within society. Where do you believe the outrage comes from among, many when they hear that a person convicted for murder is now eligible for parole? Where do you think the disconnect is, and what chips away at the trust that the public has in the system, keeping those who should remain in prison, keeping them in prison, but also affording reintegration for those who can be reintegrated?
Well, I think it relates to the high crime rates in the country currently, and that it should be, the society at large might believe that an offender who has committed a very serious offense should remain in jail for the longest possible time, and that is an aspect that should be considered. However, if one looks at the white paper on correctional services and the intentions behind the act when it was passed in, I think it was 2008, if I'm not mistaken. The intentions there was to temper the justice and the mercy. So, for example, a judge will sentence somebody to, let's say, in this case, 18 years, knowing that the offender might be eligible for parole in 9 years. But the consideration for parole doesn't necessarily guarantee that consideration will have a favorable outcome. And there are many who are considered, and that consideration is not granted. It might take another year or even 2 or 3 years after that first consideration, because the parole board might say to the person, listen, you're not sufficiently rehabilitated, and we suggest that you go and you do another rehabilitation course. For example, they haven't completed anger management, as an example. And they will need to go and complete that particular course or another of a similar nature in order to show, listen, they are ready to reintegrate into society. Also, for the first few months after a person is released on parole, and it can be even longer, there's full supervision of the person, monitoring, reporting to police stations, practical house arrest for a fairly long time, and thereafter the restrictions are gradually released as the offenders gains the trust of correctional services, and so it's not somebody walking around in the streets, immediately after committing a perceived or a relatively heinous crime.
All right, I've got to thank you for your time. I've got to thank you for your time and your insights. And I can hear your doorbell is ringing. I assume that's your doorbell. Someone else is looking for you. That's Attorney Clifford Gordon there, giving us insights into how the parole system works after Zola Tongo was approved for release on parole in a few months' time.